all of us, frankly, on both sides of the Atlantic have gotten a little bit too comfortable with the security posture of the last 20 years, and that, frankly, that security posture is not adequate to meet the challenges of the next 20 years. So there are a lot of ways in which this alliance will evolve and change, in the same way that the alliance evolved and changed from 1945 to 1975 and from 1975 to 2005. I do think that we're in one of these phases where we're going to have to rethink a lot of big questions.
That was U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance speaking in Washington today at an event organized by the Munich Security Conference. Since the end of World War II, 80 years ago, the U.S. has been the guarantor of European security and defense. U.S. presidents, Democrats, and Republicans have reaffirmed America's commitment. Former President Barack Obama's foreign policy of pivoting to Asia seemed to put that commitment in question. But no president has threatened to close the American security umbrella over Europe the way Donald Trump has. Let's take a look.
World War II, over 60 million dead, entire cities leveled, 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazi regime. When it was all over, European countries' economies were in ruins, while the U.S., which had backed the UN and France against Nazi Germany, saw its economy boom over the course of the war. In the aftermath, the U.S. would lead the West as the Soviet Union went from ally to adversary, the goal to prevent another world war and contain the spread of communism. The U.S. and its junior partner, the U.K., led the way in establishing structures that would allow countries to cooperate, living under shared rules, or multilateralism. This was tied to a new security architecture for Europe, anchored by the NATO alliance, and a pro-trade agenda anchored by the U.S. dollar. The U.S. was to be the glue that held the world together. Establishing multilateralism meant creating institutions to establish international order. The U.S. had considerable influence on the forming of the United Nations, with New York City as the site for its headquarters.
Unity of determination to find a way to end war.
The U.S. was one of 5 nations with a permanent seat on the Security Council that helped manage Cold War tensions. Other institutions like the World Bank and the World Health Organization followed. Over the decades, the G7 and G20 groups of the world's biggest economies met to coordinate responses to global issues. That was tied to finance. The so-called Bretton Woods system, set up shortly before the end of World War II, was an agreement that set the dollar as the world's reserve currency. It was meant to prevent the spread of economic crises, to maximize cooperation and profit for all under one system. This was followed by the rise of the World Trade Organization, which aimed to help countries work out trade disputes peacefully. A new security arrangement based on U.S. military might supported the international financial system and multilateral institutions. In 1949, the U.S. helped found the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, known as NATO, an alliance to protect Europe against Soviet aggression. The U.S. deployed its armed forces throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. The core of the alliance was Article 5 of its founding document, which stated that an attack on one member was an attack on all. Over the decades, U.S. resentment festered as European countries' economies grew faster than their military expenditures. All that changed when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. Suddenly, the threat of a resurgent Russia taking territory by force shocked many NATO members, after years of pressure from the U.S. into significantly upping their military spending. For U.S. President Donald Trump, it was too little, too late. When he took office for the second time, he acted on long-held grievances against world institutions that he felt had ripped off the U.S. He's pulled the U.S. out of the World Health Organization and key trade agreements and has threatened allies with punishing tariffs. He's threatened not to come to the aid of NATO countries that haven't spent enough on defense, leaving many to wonder what happens after the U.S. abandons its friends.
Yeah, what will happen? We'll talk more about that and the changing global order. I'm joined now by Kelly Grieco. She's a senior fellow with the Stimson Center's Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy program. She joins us tonight from Washington, D.C. Ms. Grieco, it's good to have you with us. The U.S. Vice President, J.D. Vance, he says that Europe and the U.S. are on the same team when it comes to defense and security. So why does it feel that they're not on the same team?
Yes. So, I think the challenge here is that there's two things happening at once. On the one hand, there's an important point being made that Europe needs to step up and do more for its security and defense, and we need better burden sharing within the alliance. And the second part of it, though, is that the way the Trump administration is going about it is incredibly hostile and rude. And if you think of alliances as friendships, then both of these are offensive to you. If you think about them as more about arrangements based on shared interests, then the real problem here is the antagonism and the approach of going about it. But it's a long overdue need for a reappraisal of how we share the burdens within the alliance.
Europe has relied on the U.S. to guarantee its security since the end of World War II. Doesn't Trump have a point in pressing Europe to do more? I mean, would you agree with him on the contents and disagree on the style of communicating the contents?
Yes, that's exactly right. I would say that on the content, on the logic of the argument that Europe needs to do more, he's 100% right. And I've been arguing this for a decade. The way he's going about it is not particularly helpful. I think it's important to also put Trump in a bit of context and to recognize he's not the first president to push the burden sharing issue. Yeah. This goes back to Eisenhower actually threatening a agonizing reappraisal, he called it, if Europe didn't do more. So this has been a constant source of tension. The difference is today with China rising is that it's becoming a more acute problem.
Yeah. You have said that Trump is taking a sledgehammer approach to U.S. foreign policy and the institutions around it. What do you think will replace it?
That's a good question. I would just say one of the main concerns is his approach seems to be to break it, but not offer an alternative. We're seeing a gutting of the State Department, for example. Its budget is dramatically smaller, yet he's also trying to work two diplomatic deals, one with Iran and one with Russia and Ukraine. So, the logic here, oftentimes he behaves in ways that are very contradictory and almost seem to undermine his own goals. So these seems to be a clear strategy, though, on the part of the administration, that it's better to break things that they dislike, even if they don't have an alternative. And I think this is the real challenge, is it's not clear what is going to emerge to replace it.
With European countries now increasing spending on defense and security like never before, is it possible that Europe could one day reach military parity with the United States? And would Europe want that? And would the U.S. want to be at eye level with Europe when it comes to military muscle?
Yeah, I think you asked such a great question because we have always been a little contradictory about this, and that we want Europe to do more, but we've also wanted to maintain control and leadership of the alliance. And of course, you can't ask Europe to spend more on defense, potentially becoming a partner, as you say, or an equal in terms of its levels of defense spending, and not recognize that they have to have greater voice within the alliance, that they have to have opportunities for leadership. So I think that's going to be a key test, frankly, for the Trump administration, is that they're actually going to be open to that kind of shift, not just in terms of burden sharing, but also responsibilities, leadership, voice of the alliance. One issue I would be looking at is if they push the issue of whether U.S. defense firms need to have access to European defense funds, like if they need to be a competitor for those funds. In the past, they've objected about that, or if they're actually allow that issue to go so that Europe can actually use its funds to build up its own defense industry.
Former U.S. President Barack Obama, he spooked Europe when he announced his pivot to Asia foreign policy. President Trump, as you said, is not the first U.S. leader who considers the Indo-Pacific region, not Europe, to be the focus of American thought and power moving forward. Is this the reality of the 21st century that Europe has to come to terms with?
Yes, it does. I would just say that one of the things that I worry about is that the United States has asked politely for Europe to do more for its defense. We've asked clearly less politely, but it's been very slow. There's been a lot of feet dragging. And I don't think there's a desire on the part of the United States, including under the Trump administration, to see an end of the NATO alliance and to see an end of the relationship and partnership with Europe. But it almost feels as though Europe's slow pace of actually stepping up and taking on more of the burden is forcing our hands in ways that we don't want. So that's, I think, the question is, can we get through this transition? Because we've done this before. In 1969, Nixon announced the Nixon Doctrine that we were scaling back our commitments in the Indo-Pacific so that we could step up more in Europe. And our alliance has endured. Now it's time for us to do something similar, but with Europe.
Kelly Grieco, unfortunately, we're out of time. Fascinating talking with you. We appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.